Welcome to this next installment of the MSL Learn webinar series with our friend Bryce Maxell from the Montana Natural Heritage Program. We're excited to share another component or another way for citizens and patrons of libraries in particular to both contribute and to engage with information that helps communities, helps them and really helps people deeply understand the natural resources of our state. So with that brief introduction, Bryce, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen here, and hopefully you're seeing that.
Yes, looks
Okay,
great.
great. Well, I'm Bryce Maxell. I'm the program coordinator at the Montana Natural Heritage Program, and today I'm going to give you an overview of the information that is managed by the Montana Natural Heritage Program, how that's used in environmental reviews, permitting, planning processes, and then how to request that information. Um, so basically, you want to start with a little background on the program. The program was established by the Montana State Legislature in 1985 to be a common set of information that's available to everyone on the species and habitats of Montana, and to inform environmental review, permitting, and planning processes. Today, we also inform disaster response and invasive species response efforts. And the whole idea is to have that information readily available so that just good decisions can be, or informed decisions can be made quickly, and then save time and money. And then again, let Montana decide how to run Montana instead of having species listed, for instance. There we go. Just to give you an overview of our data holdings, we kind of think of this in a pyramid of information. At the bottom of that pyramid is information on taxonomy of species and habitats, and we're managing 16,593 different species and habitats at this point, and also just about to add 1,250 new algae species to our database, and that will pretty much have a full listing for all botanical species at that point. Structured surveys are surveys that were performed using a standard protocol to detect one or more species. We've got about 500,000 of those. Observations, over 5 million of those, 5.3 million at this point. Species of concern occurrences are polygons of the delineate populations of species of concern. And that's so that we make sure that those species stay as common as possible in any environmental management effort. We make predicted habitat suitability models for species so that we have a better understanding of their landscape suitability for them. We've got about 1,400 species modeled at this point. We also stack up those models and make predicted biodiversity layers. And range polygons for species, we have about 3,400 species now with range polygons. And then we've assigned state conservation status ranks to about 5,000 of those species. Here's what that looks like spatially. For observations, surveys, species of concern occurrences, and models. You can kind of see in the observations, surveys, and occurrences there that we have some data holes, mostly centered around tribal lands. There's some tribal data sovereignty issues there, where they don't want to share information in our data system. And part of that is just lack of resources for them to do surveys as well. And you can also see some holes on major cropland areas and private lands. Here's just a couple of views of our predicted biodiversity models. On the left is a overall native vertebrate biodiversity. So all of the animals with backbones, we've modeled all of them. We've stacked up those models, and the areas with the hottest colors there, the yellows, are predicted to have the highest number of species. and or the habitat in that area is predicted to support the highest number of species. And then the areas in blue, the cooler colors, predicted to have habitat that supports the lowest number of species. And you can see a zoom in there of Gallatin County below that. On the right is a overall cumulative risk map of invasive species. And again, the hottest areas there are predicted to be the overall highest cumulative risk of having noxious, state-listed noxious weeds invade those landscapes. And the blue areas are predicted to have the lowest cumulative risk of invasion of state-listed noxious weeds. We also manage information on the statewide land cover layer. These are mapping of existing vegetation communities. And then on the right here, an overview of where we have detailed national wetland inventory mapping of wetland and riparian areas. The green areas we have all mapped, and the black areas are getting some updates. The blue areas are still lacking this national wetland inventory mapping, and we are slowly chipping away at that. For invasive species, we do, over the last 7 years now, we have managed information on invasive species. We now have about over 1,300 non-native species that are either present in the state, that are documented, or have strong potential to be established or become established in the state. We're approaching 1 million observation records for those invasive species. About 3/4 of that is vascular plants or weeds, but the remainder are animals. We have over 1,200 different data sources that we've brought together on weed information. We send out quarterly reports to weed managers on new weeds in their area so that they can undergo control efforts. On the right of this slide is just some data sources that are kind of the top data sources for weed information.
And Bryce, I can't help but ask, escargot isn't the actual species name, is that right?
It is actually one. It actually is one common name for
Okay.
the species. Roman snail is another. This is a population that has become a small population at this point on the lower Grant Creek watershed outside of Missoula. Not sure how it got established, but it was reported on an iNaturalist app, which is a citizen science application that people can load on their phones. We have a recorded presentation on that in the MSL Learn series.
Yes.
And they can kind of wreak havoc in local areas and outcompeting native invertebrates, and also causing they can be a disease vector for various diseases that affect vertebrates.
Thank you.
Yeah, we bring all of that information together in an environmental summary report, and we can do that very quickly within a matter of a couple minutes for a local watershed, any kind of environmental review, permitting, planning process. We've built this environmental summary report to fit into National Environmental Policy Act processes and also Montana Environmental Policy Act processes, to be kind of a document of record of what species and habitats are present in an area that's being considered for some sort of environmental management action. That comes with a companion Excel and field guide files, and you can see a table of contents there. We'll walk you through this as part of the main portion of this presentation. The main thing I want you to realize, though, is that we can generate these in just a matter of minutes for any standard jurisdictional boundary, watershed boundary across the state, or a custom boundary across the state in a matter of minutes. I wanted to note that agency resource managers can access this information directly and run the reports themselves with a agency level password. We have about almost 1,600 individuals that have access at this point to that and can just run the reports directly themselves. Private individuals, we can run those reports for you, and I'll show you a couple times during this presentation how to request that. But I want to make the point that what the agency biologists are seeing and what the public would see when they when they get a request run for them and returned to them is the exact same information. So we're just not making precise locational data of species available freely to everyone on the internet. So how does someone, a patron of a library, who's concerned about something going on in their area, how do they request an environmental summary report or other information from us? They can go to our website with the link here at the top, hover over the data tab, click on submit request, go down, that will open up this request tracker. And the next thing you'll do is set up a user profile. You'll log in with that profile, and then you're going to file a new request. And that example of what that looks like is down here at the bottom with a 5 on it. And essentially, you'll just say, here's what I'm doing, here's what I need it for, and here's the location. And we'll typically get that back out to you within a business day. So it's not a turnaround of minutes, but fairly quickly within a business day. What you'll then get back within that business day is you'll get a link to download in the upper left of this slide, a zipped file folder, and that will contain a PDF that is the main environmental summary report. It will then, that main environmental summary report will walk through this, but part of it contains lists of species that are either documented or potentially present in the area. And then we provide field guides for all of those species. So we've got this folder that contains documents with field guides. It's not the same as the full online field guide accounts, but it is a distillation of the field guide accounts that are online. So, and you also get an Excel file, and the Excel file is the same information that's in the PDF of the environmental summary report, but the Excel file allows you to sort things and more readily than say you could in a PDF. And it also has a little bit more information on particular habitat types that species occupy, so that may be of use as well. Finally, we also give you a link to this video on how to interpret and use environmental summary reports. It's about an hour-long video, but we wanted to make sure that everybody knows exactly how to use them and interpret them. So I'm going to walk you through what is contained in an environmental summary report. And these are screenshots actually from our online map viewer web application that the agencies see, but the reports, the PDF reports that you get are essentially, very similar, same information, just slightly different formatting. So let's look at this. The first component of the environmental summary report is a list of the documented species of concern occurrences. And so you'll see this list of species on the left side, and on the right, you can see how many how many species of concern occurrences occur in that area, how many observations of that species have been reported to our databases in that area, what the predictive habitat suitability models are telling us about that species, and then the range information for that species. Is it within a year-round range or a summer range or a migratory range? And then there will be delineation criteria. I mentioned these polygons that are mapping local populations of species of concern. And we want to provide the criteria that we're using to say, translate an observation of, say, this golden eagle in the middle here. If someone sees a golden eagle flying over, that does not meet the delineation criteria. The delineation criteria are, it has to be a confirmed nesting area. And then we'll buffer that confirmed nesting area out by 3,000 meters, which is what we found in the scientific literature as a home range size for the species where they'll forage or re-nest, for instance. We also show you the agency status for different agencies for each species. And so this is our documented species section of the environmental summary report. But we also, I mentioned earlier, we create predicted habitat suitability models for individual species. So we also have a section of the report that is based around potential species. You'll notice The list is very similar here on the left of species, and on the right, this time we don't have any observations for these species in this local area that this report was run on, but you can see the predictive modeling output field there. And I did not explain this in the last slide, but we in our predictive models, we delineate areas of the landscape that might be low suitability, that's the yellow here, moderate suitability, that's the orange, and optimal suitability, that's the red. And you can see we've got these models stacked with species at the top that have some optimal habitat. As we go down this list, we lose the optimal habitat and we just have moderate and low. And then as we go further down the list, you can see the moderate least suitable habitat shrinking and only low suitability habitat present. So again, this is the potential list. So we're giving a voice to species that might not have had surveys done in this landscape, but might very well be there because there's suitable habitat present. Again, with those lists of species, we also provide these field guide accounts, and I wanted to give you a sense for what those look like. We've got these individual accounts, and they are just very basic photo of the species, its distribution in the state, observations that we have for species in the state, what time of year those observations come in, and then some information on how to identify the species and the habitat that the species uses. So we also have information on structured surveys. That is where a particular protocol, and the protocols are listed out here on the left, has been followed to detect one or more species. And we also provide information on how many of those surveys have been performed within the area of interest, what the count of observations resulting from those surveys has been, and what year the most recent survey was done, so that you or a natural resource manager can assess, is there a need to inform this environmental review process? Is there a need for additional surveys, more recent surveys, or have there been recent surveys done? We also provide a land management summary, and that gives you both an acreage and a percentage breakdown of the land stewardship or ownership for the area of interest. And you can see how much is public lands, within the public lands, how much is federal and state, and then also underneath those, the individual agencies that are responsible for managing those lands. We do provide information on local and also conservation easements. We do not provide detailed information on private lands. And in this case, we're looking in here at the Helena Valley, and we see that 90% of that area that's shown on screen is private lands. Provide a summary of land cover for the area, and again, provide a percentage and acreage of each of the habitat types in the area. Again, this particular example is dominated by cultivated crops and developed areas, but you can see what the natural cover types were, and 36% of this area is still native grasslands, 9% wetland and riparian systems, and 5% shrub, steppe, and savanna systems. We also provide maps and an overview of the number of acres of various national wetland inventory mapping types, and we provide a link to a story map so that you can understand what these various wetland mapping codes mean. But in general, wetlands are very important to plant and animal species, far outweighing their presence on the landscape. They are where our biodiversity resides, and so we want to provide detailed mapping of these particular types of habitats. We also provide a list of any biological reports that are associated spatially with this area. And so those are just listed out. And if we've got PDFs, we let you know that. And finally, a list of the invasive and pest species that are either documented or based on our predicted habitat suitability models may very well invade an area because the habitat is suitable for them. And so that way you can identify before any management actions have taken place. If I disturb the ground here, what weeds are likely to move in. I'm not going to get into this, but we do provide some summary tips for how to use the environmental summary report. And remember that video that I mentioned, that again goes out to everybody standard. And so you've got an hour-long video there that will walk you through how to interpret and use an environmental summary report. I want to get close to ending here. I'm going to do this twice, once on a slide and once on a live website. I want to just remind you how you can tell patrons to request information from the Montana Natural Heritage Program on our website. Again, go to the Data tab, click on Submit Request. Then you're going to see Request Tracker pop up. You're going to set up a user profile, log in with that profile, file a new request, and on that new request filing, you'll just say, here's in general what I'm needing this information for. Provide a description of what you want. In most cases, it's going to be an environmental summary report, but it could be a geodatabase if you're a consultant and have GIS skills. That's Geographic Information System skills. And then what was the location of the area that you wanted the information for? And with that, I'm going to skip out of our PowerPoint and just do that live here. Again, our live website, data, submit request, request tracker. Click on user profile. You'll create a new user profile just by entering your name and your contact information. Then you would, again, log in with that. I'll log in myself here. And then you're going to file a new request and put in the request title. Say I want, probably in most cases, an environmental summary report for such and such process, and say I want it for this address, this public land survey section, this watershed, whatever the area of interest is to you. You also need to talk about the intended use. And here's where I want to remind everybody that here at the Montana State Library, we follow the Library Confidentiality Act strictly. And so we cannot share the nature of your request or the patron's request with anyone. That's protected. So we do that in part because we want to make sure that we are providing the information that they actually need. And that we let people know this because it makes them feel comfortable that that request information cannot be shared with anyone. Specific request information. We can certainly track how many requests we get and things like that. But and with that, I'll take any questions that we have.
Thanks, Bryce. I'll let our viewers think a little bit and see if they have some questions. But one of the things that I wondered, just like in general, is, how many requests come from private citizens, and then like how much are not just the GIS professionals, but let's say somebody who wants to develop a subdivision or that sort of thing. Can you kind of characterize who are the people who are requesting this type of information?
Certainly, we'll get on average about 3 to 5 requests every day, every day of the week, and I would say about 2/3 of those are consultants, and someone has hired that consultant to help them work through an environmental review process. That could be, it literally is everything under the sun. We recently, in fact, I can show you this. We haven't turned this on yet, but on our new website that we are about to release, under our resources section, we have summarized all the different laws and administrative rules and federal regulations, executive orders, and processes and permits that our information is used to help, guide people through these processes. And so there are literally, we put in over 100 of them so far, and I think we're just scratching the surface, actually. And so, yeah, that's the basics. I hope I answered your question there, Clay.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, just knowing and thinking from a library or, whether it's library staff or just a general patron perspective, there's so much information about the land that we stand on and the species and, you know, all of that information, and it is publicly available through the systems that the Montana Natural Heritage Program manages. So I just think it's
For
such a
free.
treasure trove.
For free, yeah.
Yeah, for
That's a bit,
free.
I should have made that point much earlier, but free to everybody. And that way, any citizen can have a voice in a National Environmental Policy Act process or a Montana Environmental Policy Act process. They have free access to the same information that the federal agency resource managers do. So it's not biased by only those who can, afford quote big money. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and like I've mentioned in some of our other sessions too, the student who is taking an advanced science course in high school or um, someone who is looking for information, there really isn't a barrier other than knowing where to go and ask for the information, whether it's a report or something that they're working on, as an internship, whatever it is, that information is right here and available.
Yeah, that's a really important point in terms of research. There's also a very low barrier to getting up to speed on how to do research on species in Montana, because we can just very quickly turn over all the information that has been aggregated for many decades in our program to someone who wants to conduct research on a particular species. And so that really helps move things forward more quickly on that front. And again, most research is done to inform natural resource management policy.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at this time. I want to thank you, Bryce, for sharing this information with us. As always, we appreciate any feedback. I've put the evaluation form link in the chat. And thanks so much, Bryce, for sharing this information.
You're very welcome. You have a good day, and please just I will actually put it in the chat for everybody, but please send me an email if you've got any follow-up questions.
That sounds great.
All
Thank
right,
you.
have a good day, everyone.
Yep.